recording, and I say welcome to you all because it's now on the dot of 11 o'clock. Thank you very much for joining us. We are expecting more people, and as I said, every so often my eyes will wander this way. That means that I either haven't slept enough last night or I'm looking at the waiting room. I'm going to now mute you all in a way that you can't unmute yourselves. Terribly sorry about that, but David and Miriam, I'm going to now try to unmute you if you click on unmute, because you'll sound so much better. There you go. And welcome to all of you. It's lovely to see people coming from near and far. I suppose we've got no one this time from New York. We've had before, but I can see someone coming in all the way from Gold Coast. Lovely to see you. I'm going to do a quick welcome to David and Miriam. It's lovely to see you guys. Thank you very much for joining us today for our Thursday Lunch Club.
And thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. And we're just welcoming in Emmy Monash. We've got another Emmy Monash level already on, so just give them a moment. So we welcome also to those aged care homes who look after our seniors. And David and Miriam, tell us a little bit about your family.
Okay, so David Klein, wife Miriam. We're blessed with 5 lovely boys, range in ages from 16 to 23. And what can I say? We're part of the Kilda Talmud community. And more than that, not much to say unless you have any specific questions you'd like to ask.
Yeah, look, I'd like to know their dates of birth and their PIN numbers. No, I'm just joking. We won't go through that. Let's get down to Tachlis, though. Before family members started getting sick, and I think it might have been a few, were you personally aware of alert to to how challenging COVID would have been?
No, I mean, when we came down with it, it was in March. At that stage, obviously people were aware of the fact that that COVID was around, but at that stage, we didn't really treat it any differently to any other virus that one hears about, or flu that one hears about, which, I mean, every year one expects the flu to come about and people get affected by it, but we never thought much more about it other than, like I say, it was going to be just another flu that was hitting. And as a result, when we started experiencing various flu-like symptoms and that, we just did the regular thing, obviously, which was just to stay home, but never expected that it would develop in the way that it did.
Now, David, and I'll turn to Miriam in a moment. David, you said flu-like symptoms. When was this? You said in March. Around what date? And then what did you notice?
So it manifested itself differently for the different members of the family. So in my particular case, I actually didn't even know that I had a flu. It really just started off as a bad cough, which lingered for about 2 weeks, and then eventually developed into what it developed into. In the case of other members of the family, like Miriam and one of my other boys, they had the typical flu-like symptoms of just confined to bed because of aching all over and that sort of thing. But like I say, nothing different to a conventional flu, if one can call a conventional flu conventional. But yes, nothing more than what one would otherwise expect.
Right. Now, you guys live in Melbourne. I won't give your actual address. You'll have a big fan club outside. You guys live in Melbourne. Were all the kids in Melbourne in March?
No, they weren't. So three of our 5 boys were overseas at the time when this all started. When I started with the cough-like symptoms, one of our boys returned from England. And when he returned, within about a day, he started displaying these flu-like symptoms. And about a day or 2 later, Miriam started experiencing that as well. But the interesting thing was that, again, at that stage, people could only be tested for COVID under one of 2 scenarios: either that they had returned from overseas and were displaying these flu-like symptoms, or alternatively that they had been in contact with a confirmed case. So when our son came back, Ari, and like I say, a day or two late, he started displaying symptoms. We immediately, we had him checked. So that was on a Friday, we had him checked. On the Saturday night, we received a message that he had come back positive. When we went to have him checked, at that stage, I had this bad cough, so I wanted to be tested. They wouldn't test me because, again, the rules at the time. So we had to wait until he was a confirmed case, which was, I say, on Saturday night. So immediately on Sunday, I think we all went in, those of us who were here. So Miriam, myself, and two of the other boys, and we were tested, and Miriam and I both came back positive, and our other two sons came back negative at that stage.
Okay. Now, Ari, you said came back from overseas.
Yeah.
Did he have to go into quarantine at that stage in March?
Yes, he did.
Yeah. So how did that work, Miriam?
So he was in quarantine, but we weren't until we became sick and confirmed cases.
And so just to explain,
those were the rules at the time. DHS called us and we followed exactly what they told us.
And bearing in mind as well,
once a person got tested at the time as well, they had to stay confined in the house until they got their results.
Yep, that hasn't changed. Yes.
Yes, but it wasn't quarantine in the sense of quarantine of what we have nowadays, whereby when one arrives from overseas that they have to be quarantined in a hotel or whatever. That stage there was no such thing. It was just simply a matter that if one was found to be positive, then they had to stay home, which is
we tried to quarantine Ari a bit. One of the other boys had come back a few days before Ari, but he was fine. So then we had 4 boys at home. 2 can come back and 2 were here and 1 still stayed overseas. So we tried to keep Ari separate, but we live in a pretty small place and we tried our best. So, but before he was quarantined and tested on Friday and quarantined with a positive Motzei Shabbos, he was a little bit, we just live in a small place. It was impossible. So
yeah,
I got sick, and I don't know, we're not sure exactly how David got sick because David had this cough from before anybody came back overseas. David started a cough that was this hacking cough. That started actually at the beginning of March. So we don't really know when David started or what his, right now they talk about the disease origins and the different strains, but they never told us what David had or if David was exposed twice, possibly. We don't know.
Now, how old is Ari?
19.
19. And he came back from where?
From England.
Okay. Now, Miriam, how you and the kids, did you experience different symptoms from those experienced by David?
So Ari was quite sick and feverish for a few weeks. And I guess caught it quite quickly from Ari. And then I was feverish and had symptoms for a few weeks. We knew about the losing of the taste symptom way before everybody else did. We lost our sense of taste and smell quite quickly. The other 3 boys that were home, our son who was overseas got it overseas where he was in England. The other 3 boys that were home did get it eventually, but they were only sick for a few days, 2, 3, max 4 days. A little bit of fever. By 3 or 4 days, they were finished. I was sick for quite a few weeks and stayed in the house for a lot of weeks. It was quite clear when Ari was finished and better. His symptoms stopped, his fever stopped, and he felt a lot better. He was weak for a bit, and then that also passed. So I got sick worse than David at first, and then David seemed to start showing the same symptoms that I had, but he went from bad to really bad and worse very quickly in like a couple of days, basically.
Okay, so let me get this. So David, you've started showing some symptoms already early March.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how many days or weeks is this before things really look bad?
About a couple of weeks before. And then as Miriam was saying, essentially what happened was that ironically, after the two of us were confirmed cases, in other words, that was about, I think, what we went on Sunday, the Monday already.
Yeah.
We were told were confirmed cases. Ironically, Miriam was in a far worse state than I was, as in, like I said, she was confined to bed. I wasn't allowed out, obviously, and couldn't go to work. But I remember speaking to my work at the time and saying, well, actually, I've got it, but the only thing I've got is just a bad cough. I said, my wife has it worse than I do. It was later that week, I think it was like the Thursday, that I started going downhill very quickly. And that manifested itself in terms of, like Miriam was saying, that I started developing those flu-like symptoms that she had. And it basically just got to this, it was getting worse and worse. And then by the Saturday night, got to the stage where I just could not move anymore. Yeah. And that's when Miriam then called the ambulance.
So that's the trigger for realizing it's time to go off to hospital.
So at one point on Shabbos, David gave a cough that I knew was pneumonia. I just knew. So we just, we called the ambulance after Shabbos. Yeah.
Now,
David, what happens once, I assume that the two of you go off to hospital, or is it only David?
Well, interesting that you asked that. So the ambulance guys checked me out, and they said that my oxygen levels weren't good, and they were going to have to take me to hospital. Miriam asked us to whether she could come as well, considering that I
wanted to come so badly. I said, please, can I come? They said, if you come to the hospital, you need a separate ambulance. You can't come with David anyway. I had a fever at the time, but they said my oxygen was fine, and they told me, really, please stay at home.
So, I mean, they said that Miriam would recover, obviously, better being at home. In my case, there was no question I had to go to the hospital because of my oxygen levels. But that said, at the time, they thought that it would just be a matter of putting me on oxygen for a little while and that everything should be fine. So they took me to hospital.
Sorry to interrupt, but what date is that? Let me make a note of that.
It was on the Shabbos,
March 28th, maybe,
28th, 29th.
Okay. Right, so you go to hospital then, expecting to come home.
Yeah, maybe a day or two later, if that. So they took me to hospital. I remember that very clearly. I remember also on the way them telling me that they were going to have to go to a different entrance because I was a confirmed COVID patient, and that there'd be a team of people waiting to see me, etc. I remember them checking me out and saying, yes, hopefully oxygen will do it. But they said, if not, they were going to have to put you on a ventilator. So for several hours, I was on oxygen. And the last I can remember before they sedated me was, it must have been on the Sunday morning, I assume?
Yeah.
The Sunday morning. On the Sunday morning that they said the straight oxygen wasn't working and that I was going to have to go onto a ventilator. The last thing I remember was me saying, I recall asking them, is it, not knowing much about these things, I just simply said to them, is it true that not everybody makes it out alive after being on a ventilator? And they said, yep, that's the case. And that's as much as I, remember until later on.
Great question to ask just before they put you out. Now, I'm going to switch back to Miriam for a moment. Miriam, this is Saturday night. They've told you, look, not worth coming. Your oxygen levels are okay. Stay at home. Then how are you kept informed by the hospital? What's going on?
So I gave it about an hour and I called the hospital.
This is the Alfred?
I called the Alfred. They told me they were just getting David checked in. I said, okay. At some point, one of the nurses or somebody said to me, oh, he'll probably be here for about 3 weeks. And I said, whoa, 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I said, oh, okay. But then on Sunday, they hadn't put him on the ventilator yet when I called in the morning. I did most of the calling at that point. They hadn't put him on the ventilator, so I had hoped that maybe he didn't need it. But that was not the case when they called on Sunday. I think they called us. The nurse called with David. David couldn't talk, but he sent us a message. Number one, call his work and tell them what's happening.
It was number one, yes.
Well, I don't know the order. Number two was, don't forget to sell the chametz.
Yes.
And number 3, that he loves us, of course.
Now, when was Pesach? Do you remember this? Pesach is later that week, is it?
That was Motzei Shabbos Mevarchim.
So 2 weeks.
There's 2 weeks, by the way. Shabbos Mevarchim is 2 weeks before Pesach. So
Yes.
this is one of the last things he's telling you. How are you feeling when you're getting this call?
Oh, well, you could already see that tears in my eyes now.
I'm getting it a bit myself, by the way. That's okay.
Yeah, a difficult time.
Yeah. Now, David, you couldn't speak. It's not just the ventilator, but also you need the oxygen to.
Yeah.
So between your coughing and struggling for a bit of oxygen, you're not able to say anything. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. David, what's the first recollection you have after that period? Is it days later, weeks later? Where are we up to?
So, a very good question. And the reason I say that is because in terms of a clear recollection of being somewhere, or sort of knowing where I was and what was happening, that was several weeks later. So the reason I say good question is because that's, as I say, recalling where I was and what was happening, and that was several weeks later. But in the intervening period, when I now realized that I was heavily sedated, all I can recall is a period of the most horrendous nightmares that I was having, and that, but not knowing obviously what was going on, etc. And I still reflect back, went through a whole Pesach and that, and I have no recollection of Pesach whatsoever because I was under at the time. And essentially, just the timeline, just to put things into perspective. So essentially, what happened was that they put me on the ventilator. I was on the ventilator for a period of just over 3 weeks. During that time, Miriam was in constant contact with the hospital to find out how things are going. They kept on telling her on a daily basis that everything's stable. It's all fine. No change one way or the other. And then sometime after 3 weeks, in that 4th week, one of the professors at the hospital came to see me, and apparently he's an expert in this ECMO machine. He apparently, looking at my results, told them that the results were quite deceptive, and that whilst things appeared to be stable and normal, and that was only because, thank God, the rest of my major organs were functioning perfectly, and therefore gave the impression that everything was fine. But in actual fact, he said that my lungs had become completely stiff, and that if I wasn't put onto a different form of treatment, which ended up being an ECMO machine, that I wouldn't survive it. That said, so he rang Miriam to tell her all of this, and he told her that he was putting me on the ECMO machine, but that said, the chances of survival were no more than 30%. So it was a very bleak outlook, to say the least.
Now, David, if I may, because you've jumped a whole period of time, and I want to come back to the ECMO machine in a moment, because I want to turn to Miriam, because there's 3 or 4 weeks you're telling us.
Yeah.
She's experiencing something different during that time.
Oh, very much so.
And I'm going to turn to Miriam for a moment before we pick up with the ECMO machine. I'm going to turn to Miriam for a moment and check what's happening from her end. By the way, just to clarify, the ventilator is providing positive pressure oxygen to the lungs. So basically filling the lungs and allowing to collapse again. Right. So just so that's clear. So before we come back to ECMO machine, we're going to do that, David. Miriam, 3 to 4 weeks. And what's happening?
What's happening? Thank God I had 4 boys home with me. Mm-hmm. And we did a lot of davening. Yeah. A lot of davening. And the first week, I would say, I guess we just expected David to be in hospital for about a week. So I said, let's just make believe he's on a business trip. Yeah. And so we weren't really concerned. And then we had and I was also quite sick at the time, so I was a bit numb, I guess you would say. The second week already, I mean, there's just so many times you can ask the doctor, and then thank God we had a whole community behind us. Everybody was texting and calling and asking any change. And I would say to the doctor would call me every day And I called the nurses a few times a day. Any change, any change, no change, no change. So after, about 3 weeks of no change, sort of like start thinking, well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
So yeah, we turned to Hashem and we just begged and pleaded.
Miriam?
And so did the whole community.
I was going to ask you how important is community in these times?
Community is irreplaceable. We just had so much support from everybody across the board, from your family, from our whole family, from the whole Melbourne family. Everybody was one big family. I can't even tell you all the things that people did. The texting, the davening, the learning, the helping, the dropping things off when we didn't even know we needed it. All the things that just appeared and helped us were just incredible. The boys had friends who would run around and just, get them a burger if they felt like it. Can't imagine all the things and the support, the people just coming and saying, we're davening, we're here. It was unbelievable. We live in an unbelievable community.
Miriam, before I come back to you, David, Miriam, a lot of people don't know because they may not have been part of the WhatsApp chain and so on. Tell us a bit about learning and communal davening.
I am not on WhatsApp either, but I have some boys who are.
Yeah.
There were actually quite a few Tehillim groups.
Yes.
There were some ladies groups. There were quite a few boys groups. There was one group that people were continuously through the night around the clock saying Tehillim. I think they went through Tehillim, I think it was like 75 times around the clock. When there were people weren't, there was somebody just going on around the world. One of the boys' friends organized, he was going to do 48 hours of learning, continuous through the night. There were people who took 2:00 in the morning in Melbourne, and that turned into, I think, 96 hours because there's so many people signed up. Thank God. We live in an unbelievable community.
Can I say on the receiving end of the WhatsApps, what happened for those who don't know, but then someone would say, I'm now doing chapter 79 of the Tehillim. And then after a minute, a few seconds later, someone says, well, I'm starting number 80. And someone else would say, I'll do 81. And that kept going nonstop.
Yeah. I should also just add into that what you're referring to is what was going on in Melbourne. But then in addition to that, because we've got boys in that from England in Shiva overseas and family overseas as well, there were people across the globe, and there were people in Israel, in America, in England, in Belgium, in Holland, Switzerland, you name it. It was just incredible.
Yeah. Okay. And Miriam, David has a change of name, but is not aware of it at that stage. What's that about?
So on the day that the professor, well, David doesn't remember, but the professor actually explained to David that his lungs were deteriorating also, and that he needed to be on the ECMO machine. We didn't know what to do. So I think we were thinking about it, but then we asked, and one of the boys sent in somebody they know into Rav Moshe Sternbuch and asked if we should change David's name. And his answer was Chaim David Meir. There was no question. He didn't say yes. He just said that's his new name. So then my son,
which is an addition of the word name Chaim
to David Meir, to David,
Yeah.
And so one of the boys, and the way the name change is supposed to be done is with a minyan of men. There was no minyan of men davening in Melbourne. It was done in Israel at one of our sons' yeshivas. Because they were in lockdown, there were boys who were stuck in yeshiva and they had a minyan. They were considered one household. And so Rav Tzvi Koshalevsky,
who your brother studied under,
organized it. And we actually listened on the telephone to the davening. It was very emotional. And we didn't tell David about it for a while.
Now, before we come back to you, David, Miriam, during this time, what's happening with yours and the kids' health?
So by then, everybody was better probably. I had no strength to do anything. I was just sitting at the kitchen table saying to Helen every day, working a little bit in between because a lot of people depend on me for my work. And the kids were learning during the day and keeping busy. And, you know, like I said, one son was still in England. We were trying to get him back. His flight kept getting canceled.
Yeah.
And so he spent Pesach in England with David's sister and her family. They were all sick as well, but
In Manchester.
In Manchester. David's sister was in and out of the hospital a couple of times also. Thank God she did not need to be ventilated. And then after Pesach was over, we were trying to get him home. And one of our boys' friends is a complete aviation fanatic, and he checks flights all day, every day. So he told us about this Qantas repatriation flight that leaves London. So we booked our oldest son on that flight. He had to travel from Manchester the week after Pesach was over, like a whole week later. He had to travel from Manchester to London on a train, which he did. And when he left was a very difficult week. That was when David was being put on the ECMO at the time when we had no idea what was going to happen.
Miriam, dare I ask, you don't have to answer, did you ever lose hope?
No.
Didn't take you long to think about that?
No.
Okay.
Look, I imagined all scenarios, but I never lost hope.
David, what's an ECMO machine? What was that about?
Well, I can't give you the full name, but essentially what it does is that it oxygenates a person's blood. So basically, the way I understand it now is that they have one tube going out, taking the blood out of the individual, going through this machine, oxygenating, and then putting back that blood into the individual. And so apparently, from what I understand, the professor told Miriam that I would need to be on this particular machine for a minimum of a month and most probably more. And the way that it worked was that for the first week of being on that machine, I needed also to remain on the ventilator as well, but I don't understand the ins and outs, apparently dialed down or something. So it's the ECMO machine that's doing all the work, but in the ventilator just basically keeps the lungs inflated. And they took me then off the ventilator after 1 week. And I remained then on the ECMO machine quite surprisingly and quite miraculously, not a month, but in fact, only 2 weeks in total. And at the end of the 2 weeks, they just simply said that I could come off it. But that said, I'm really underplaying the various miracles that occurred all along the way. So there was everything ranging from the fact that this particular professor happened to have walked in and discovered that things were not as rosy as they were, and that something needed to be done ASAP because no one else had picked up on that.
Well, the first miracle was they called me during Chol HaMoed and said, don't panic, but David's ventilator just broke. Okay, so I didn't tell most people this story because, yeah. So, but we got him back on another one within 5 minutes. So I said, why 5 minutes? So they said, well, we had to get another one in there. And the nurse was on, David had a nurse with him 24/7. Because I said, where was the nurse? They said she found it, but then we had to find another ventilator and make sure that one was working. I'm like, okay. So we're hoping there's no brain damage or anything. He was only off oxygen for 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So later that day, it happens to be they turned down David's sedation a little bit, and we actually spoke to him. I actually spoke to David, and he told me something which was completely traumatic altogether as well. But he did speak to me, and it was something intelligible. So I wasn't worried.
David, any recollection of that?
None whatsoever. And from what I understand now is that apparently when they put me on this ECMO machine, they needed apparently to heavily dial down the sedation apparently. Although that said, like I say, I really have no recollection of that whatsoever. My first recollection really was sometime during that second week of being on the ECMO. I remember being there in a hospital bed and having these connect up to all these tubes, and I knew nothing about this ECMO machine other than the fact that I know that I was quite uncomfortable just lying there in bed, and I try and move around, and all I remember always is the nurses telling me, don't move your legs, don't move your legs. And I had no understanding of why, but essentially these tubes and that were going in and out of my legs.
Keeping you alive.
They're keeping me alive, that's right, yes. But like I say, I had...
Of course, Hashem was keeping him alive, but
yeah.
It looked like that was keeping him alive.
Yeah,
is through the machine, yes.
No question. I've got to tell you as well that we don't in any way underestimate everything that the doctors and nurses did for us. They were absolutely amazing. They're very amazing group of people, and the dedication and the empathy and everything's absolutely amazing. But like I say, in terms of this machine, so like I said, I was on the machine then for 2 weeks, and a number of things, like I say, happened. It was just quite amazing. First of all, I say when they were going to take me off the ventilator, they had prepared Miriam and told her that I was going to need a tracheotomy in order to be able to...
You want to explain for those people who don't know what that is?
I don't think...
Yeah, I'll go for it.
So it'll be a hole here so that, yeah.
Can breathe. And anyway,
they were prepared. We were ready. They said on the Sunday we're putting it in.
They said they're going to take me off the ventilator, and they're going to do this thing. They ring Miriam and they tell her we've taken David off the ventilator, and Miriam says, how's the tracheotomy? And they said, oh, we're not doing it. And she said, like, how come? No, he doesn't need it. Literally from one day to the next. I didn't need that. I ended up being on the ECMO machine, as I say, for 2 weeks, and then suddenly, as I say, they said there's no need beyond the 2 weeks.
From one day to the next, they said, that's it. He can come off. Everything's fine.
And what was even more amazing, Ronnie, is that they took, the radiographers took a picture of my lungs when they were at their worst, and apparently they were in a shocking state. And then they took another thing on my lungs several weeks later, and they said, it's back to normal. And they said, we can't, they simply said, we cannot explain it. So all I can say is it was just the most incredible, series of miracles and that we experienced. It's like just beyond any comprehension.
Well, and you gave a nice plug to Alfred. I was going to ask you about your treatment there, but you gave a nice plug. I was hoping you would, by the way, because I'm a volunteer there on a couple of committees. In fact, one of them I was supposed to be at a committee meeting at 11 o'clock this morning, but obviously wasn't. If you've got a few more minutes, I know we're after the time. If you've got a few more minutes, David, Time magazine ran a few weeks ago an article about long haulers. Do you know what I mean by that?
I can only assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, I've not seen the article. I can only assume that it means that people who end up suffering from COVID a whole lot longer than the actual period in which they've got COVID. Correct.
David, long hauler?
No, thank God. I am exceptionally lucky, to say the least. The way thing back, let me just provide a few more details so things fit into context. I was in ICU for a total period of 6 weeks, and then an additional week in an isolation ward called 7 West. So I was in a hospital bed, like I say, for that first 6 weeks the whole time, and then in that 7th week on and off. The result of being 6 weeks in a hospital bed and not moving is that I lost 23 kilos. My muscles were completely shot. I couldn't walk. I had difficulties writing. Initially, because of all the tubes I had in me, I couldn't talk. And so I was in a very, very bad way. And I've got to tell you, for someone who, thank God, is otherwise very healthy and very energetic, to be in a situation like that, it's quite traumatic, to say the least. And more than that, of course, one having never experienced that and to suddenly be in that situation, one never knows if they're going to recover. So I didn't know if I was be able to walk again, be able to talk. It was shocking, really, really was. And all I've got to say is that I'm extremely lucky because, thank God, all those things recovered. And yes, it did. I had a rehab period of something in the order of 12 weeks. But thank God, beyond that 12 weeks, things are basically back to normal, which is just absolutely amazing. So a long way of answering your question. Thank God I'm not in that bucket of the long haulers.
Okay, now you may not know the name Dmitry Stuzuk. Ukrainian, who, by the way, aged 33, passed away 4 days ago. He was a fitness influencer, had, I think, 1 million followers online, and originally branded COVID-19 as a hoax. He passed away from COVID 4 days ago. Any message to people who think that this is a media beat up?
Ronnie, all I can say is that having experienced it myself, having, in addition to that, obviously, the fact that around the globe, we are aware of course, of no less than 1 million people who've died from this, terrible pandemic, and many, many others than that who've not only who've had it in a bad way, but unfortunately have not recovered in the way that I have. If anybody should suggest that this is a hoax or media beat up, they might as well say that the sun isn't rising in the morning and setting in the evening. I mean, it's a nonsense, an absolute nonsense to suggest otherwise.
Now, I'm going to ask you both a question. You can, whoever answers the other one can block their ears. I don't want to influence you, but okay, Miriam, has your life or outlook on life changed?
Oh, of course, of course. Of course, we try very hard not to take anything for granted. Thank Hashem for every single day that we have. Thank Hashem for bringing David back to us. And all of our blessings, which
David,
we have many.
Your outlook or on life changed?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, look, I'm obviously, even before this all occurred, we're deeply religious people, but at the same time, I've got to tell you that after having been through such an experience, and I don't wish it upon anybody, one certainly has a far greater appreciation for life in general, for family, for the fact that as Miriam said, we're in such a wonderful community, the fact that all these basic things that we're able to do, the one many a time just takes for granted, the fact that one can walk, the fact that one can talk, the fact that one can breathe, without the aid of machines and things like that, which ordinarily, a healthy person may just take for granted. I can tell you I've got a far greater appreciation for all of those things after having experienced what I did.
Yeah. Well, a lighter question for a moment. You were interviewed by someone, a representative from the UAE, United Arab Emirates, a couple of weeks ago. How did that go?
Ronnie, it was amazing. So the story behind that is the just amazing way things just happen. When I was discharged from the hospital, the media unit of the Alfred asked if I'd be willing to be interviewed by the 7:30 report on the ABC. At that stage, I was in no position to do that, so I said no, thank you. And then they called me again several weeks ago and asked if I would do something in the particular line that they were really interested in. You touched on it yourself, and that is that they had a concern. You've got a lot of people out there who believe that this whole thing is just a media beat up, and they wanted to hear from somebody who's lived and experienced COVID, who can actually talk to it authoritatively. So they asked again if I'd do it, and I said, look, on that basis, yes, I'll do it. So we did the interview with the 7:30 report. The actual interview itself went for at least half an hour, and yet it was the whole thing, as is usually with these things, cut down to about 1 minute. But what's interesting is that Peter Conn from the Jewish News saw it on the Monday night and was quite interested by it and asked if he could write a story, so which he did. And subsequently, the Consul General of the UAE here in Melbourne, she saw that story in the Jewish News and was quite taken by it. And as a result of the fact that Israel and the UAE had recently signed the peace agreement, she wanted to reach out to the Jewish community and thought this would be a nice way to do it. So she requested, could she have a discussion with us? And she ended up having a very nice interview with us, which was then recorded and ended up as well on the Jewish News' website. So that's the story behind it.
Wow. One final question. If you had any overriding lesson from your experience, David, anything stand out?
There are, you asked for one, but there's probably a few. I think one is probably summed up by, on the last day that I was in hospital, a non-Jewish nurse came into my room and she said to me, David, she said, you should realize what's happened here is absolutely miraculous. And she said, God exists. And I must say, I was quite taken by that. And it made me reflect on a well-known a well-known Rambam, the Maimonides, where he says in the Hilchos Tanios, in the laws regarding fasts, he says when a tragedy occurs, he said that it's important that people don't just simply say, relegate it to saying that things happen and just simply push it off, but rather people need to reflect upon it and to think, what does it mean for me, and how can I improve myself as a result of, in some cases, simply knowing the tragedies occur, in other cases, the fact that I've been affected by it. And the fact of the matter is that, coming back to what we were saying before, I mean, when you consider the extent of this pandemic, it is something, I say, which has hit every country in the world. I think other than North Korea, which says they've had no cases. But aside from there, the fact of the matter is it's been devastating. Lives have been lost. Even those in that who've managed to recover, many have not been in as good situation as being economically, socially. I mean, the effect it's had has been absolutely devastating, as we all know. And therefore, I think one message certainly for myself, and I'm sure others have taken home the same message, is that reflecting back on Maimonides, it's important that everybody reflect for themselves as to what does that mean for me, and is there some way in which I can maybe slightly improve. And for every person, obviously, they need to assess what it is for them. The second thing, which Miriam touched on earlier on, is that I have far greater appreciation for what we refer in Hebrew to koach hatfilah, the power of prayer. I mean, what people did, and the fact that I recovered from such a situation, and what people did in order to make that come about. I don't underestimate that in any way. And the third thing is, which we touched on, another message is just what an incredible community we live in, and the fact that, I've always known we did, but to appreciate it from the, from a receiver's end, in terms of having, received everything that we did, whether it be both spiritually and physically, what people did was just absolutely incredible. And like I say, I think it's important that people should realize that we live in an amazing, amazing community.
Miriam and David, thank you very, very much. You've shared a lot of personal stuff, and I can tell you people have just been enraptured by everything you've had to say, and you've certainly given us some thoughts to ponder for the future. Thank you very much for sharing such private and personal stuff with us. We've certainly gained out of the experience, so thank you very much once again.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, this is being recorded as well, and it'll be uploaded to our YouTube channel a bit later today. It would be remiss of me if I didn't take the opportunity to also remind you that tonight we have the second of the 10-part series on Yad Vashem Masterclass. It's not too late to sign up if people want to do that. If you don't know about what we're doing, type in your email address now, and I'll try to make sure that I add you to the newsletter list as soon as possible. And next week we're going to be heading up north of Melbourne to Shepparton, where Dvorov's Mood is going to tell us about growing up in Shepparton. Till the age of 17, she lived there. She's going to tell us a bit about that. And then the following week we've got Beverly Honig will be speaking with us. She's a bit of a power broker amongst ladies, and she's in the top 100 female influencers in this country. She'll be speaking to us. We also have a topic in November also on could you be the next victim of cyber security issues? So lots coming up on Thursday Lunch Club. Thank you very much for joining. If you want to type in your email address and want to be added, do that now into the chat. Only I'll see it. Thank you very much, David and Miriam. All the very best.
Thank you.
To everyone else, thanks for joining us. May all your news be good news. Thanks very much.
Thank you.